anybody care? This planet's empty, I see no signs of life. Please don't tell me that the human race did not survive. There are no people in the future. There are no people. There are no people in the future. No people at all. There are no people in the future. Where did all my people go? There are no people in the future. Let me try my people call. Where are all my people? Where are all my people? I guess I'll fly away now.
Hey, everybody, welcome. Yes, it is Monday, April 24th, 2023. It is a special 1 p.m. in the afternoon. 1 p.m. in the afternoon version of Raging Chicken's Out to Coop Live. Yes, indeed it is. This is Kevin Mahoney, creator and founder of Raging Chicken. On Out to Coop Live, we talk to progressives, activists, and troublemakers of all sorts, right from our own backyards from across the country. You can also join us at the end of the week for our Friday Politics Roundup, where we break down the good, the bad, the ugly in state and national politics. You can get all our shows by subscribing to our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. You can help support this show by becoming a patron for as little as $5 a month. Head on over to patreon.com/rcpress for all the details. Or you can help out the show by heading over to our YouTube channel if you're not there already. Smash that subscribe button, like the stream for this show, and hit that notification bell so you know every time that we go live. For more PA Progressive Talk, tune into the Rick Smith Show's live stream at 9 p.m. Eastern. Wherever you get your streams, Rick's going to be there. Let's face it. And make sure you subscribe to his podcast wherever you get your podcasts. For all the details, head on over to thericksmithshow.com for the latest across all his platforms. And if you haven't checked out the Sisters of the Night Caucus podcast, I don't know what you're waiting for. The amazing PA women stirring the political cauldron behind this podcast rock the house. And they know where the bodies are buried. Make sure to follow them on Twitter at The Night Caucus. That's at The Night Caucus on Twitter. And subscribe to their podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Yes, indeed. And if you haven't heard, The Signal, yes, The Signal is a, wait, I'm going to do something real quick here, everybody. Right, there we go. The Signal is a new podcast from the Bucks County Beacon. Yes, The Signal is hosted by the Beacon's editor-in-chief, Cyril Michaleko, and produced by yours truly. Yes, indeed. Yes, what do they do on The Signal? Well, twice a month, The Signal will shine a light on the right-wing extremist currents streaming through Bucks County and beyond. Cyril invites guests to provide insight, analysis, and organizing solutions so that we can steer the community toward calmer, saner, progressive roots. Check out the information on that at thebuckscountybeacon.podbean.com, or you can get that show wherever you get your podcast. And for all you gamers out there, the Quakertown-based black family-owned gaming store called The Game Inn, yes, The Game Inn with two N's. Like, they're friends of the show. They've got everything for retro N64s, the latest for all consoles, video games for all platforms, collectibles, action figures, Funko Pops, walls of Funko Pops, and kids get discounts with every A on the report card. Check them out on their Facebook page and follow them on Twitter at The Game In. That's with two N's. If you've got a question about a game, looking for something hard to get, shoot them a message or drop them an email at thegameinpa@gmail.com. And a special shout out goes to Jonathan Mann, who wrote our intro song, There Are No People in the Future. Check out all his great stuff and follow him on his YouTube page, or follow him on his Twitter at Song a Day Man. That's at Song a Day Man on Twitter, again with two N's. And with all this craziness happening in our communities, we cannot let Paul Martino and his oligarch friends buy our schools and push extremist politics in our community. Raging Chicken has teamed up with Levelfield to launch a truly community-rooted PAC to invest in organizing, supporting local and statewide progressive candidates, and unmasking the toxic organizations injecting our communities with right-wing extremism. We're putting small-dollar donations to work to beat back the power of big money. You can get more information and drop your donation at ragingchicken.levelfield.net. We've got some great shows coming up on May 8th. Next week, we still got like 2 or 3 possibilities, but on May 8th, I welcome Mark Engler to the show. Mark is a Philly-based writer, and he's author of This Is an Uprising, How Nonviolent Revolt is Shaping the 21st Century, and a member of the editorial board of Dissent. And we're going to be talking about his latest article, Can Movements Keep Politicians from Inevitably Selling Out?, which appears in Dissent, The Forge, and Waging Nonviolence. But that's not until the 8th. We're here for this show, right? And on today's show, in this episode of Out to Coop Live, I welcome François Furstenburg to the show. François is a professor of history at Johns Hopkins University. and we'll be talking about his latest article in the Chronicle of Higher Education, Higher Ed's Grim, Soulless, Ed-Techified Future. I am depressed already, right? But he's looking at Temple's Jason Wingard, how he champions skillification. Now, he may be out, but his vision lives on. And in the wake of the unabashed anti-union tactics during the recent Temple University graduate university strike, and an overwhelming vote of no confidence by the faculty union, Temple University President Jason Wingard resigned. However, as we'll talk about today, Wingard's ideas for higher education will, in the words of Furstenburg, quote, continue marching across the landscape of higher education like zombies, transforming the content and purpose of curricula in the image of our post-industrial financialized moment, unless a broader coalition is mobilized to stop them. François has been a professor of history at Johns Hopkins University since 2014. He previously taught at the Université de Montréal. My French is like, forget about it, so I apologize in advance. From 2003 to 2013. He is the author of various books and articles on early American and Atlantic history, as well as co-author on a college textbook. He began writing essays on the state of higher education during the pandemic in 2020, when he became alarmed by the corporatization of American universities. His writing on the topic can be found at the Chronicle of Higher Education, the American Prospect, and the AAUP's magazine and blog. Welcome to the show, François.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be chatting with you.
Well, like I said to you a little bit before the show, is that I know that when I read your article, I'm like, man, do we need this kind of writing right now? For those folks who know, I'm in the State System of Higher Education, teach at Kutztown University, and we're in a contract fight of ourselves, and the guy who's at the head of the State System of Higher Education, Chancellor Dan Greenstein, comes out of this big tech world. So that's very much on a lot of folks' minds as we're facing our contract stuff. But this is kind of really much broader than our fight. We're seeing this kind of nationwide here. So let me ask you this, before we even get rolling on what you have at the center of your piece. I mean, like I said in the intro, you're a history guy writing on early American Atlantic history. And now you're talking about Jason Wingard and the Silicon Valley kind of like hucksterism. So maybe we could just start there, just for folks, like, how did you get and find your way to this path that you want to be focusing on someone like Jason Wingard in this book and what he's proposing for higher education?
Thanks for asking the question and starting there, because it's true that this is not, there's a lot of people who are very smart people and very knowledgeable people who write about higher ed, and I've been in communication with many of them, and they're impressive scholars, but this is not my field. I am an early American historian. I'm trained in early American Atlantic history. I mostly, the more time I spend in the 18th, 19th century, the happier I am. The 21st century is a depressing place to be, as far as I'm concerned. So get me out. But of course, I live and I work in the modern day academy, and in the end, it's hard to detach. I mean, much as one might sort of imagine being a kind of scholar, ensconced in a kind of ivory tower and unaffected by issues of the day. I mean, we do all live and work in certain material conditions, right? In certain institutions, right. And of course, we spend an awful lot of our time teaching and doing other kinds of service-related work. And so, actually, in many ways, this all comes out of my, I would say, kind of service component of my work. That is to say, I got, you're always dragged into different kinds of committees, and as you get promoted, you just get asked to do more and more in the university. So I got put on one committee after another, and over time, internally, getting a little depressed by finding that the sort of committee work that I did, which is asked to participate and to study some issue and make a set of recommendations for kind of internal internal direction of the university, was it became quite clear that an awful lot of that work is sort of made up work. It's sort of a Potemkin exercise in sort of self-governance. But in reality, the decision, very often, it was quite clear that decisions had already been made even before any recommendations of any, committees that I was part of were issued and decided upon. And so, I repeatedly thought to myself, what am I doing here? Why are all these
Right.
people kind of wasting their time in really good faith and spending all this time studying issues if the decisions are going to get made? And over again, anytime I was part of a committee, people would say, well, you're purely advisory. Of course, the final decision rests with the president and board of trustees. Well, okay, but usually whoever's making the decision waits to get advice and recommendations before deciding whether or not to listen to that.
Yep.
Doesn't usually happen before. So anyway, so that was the kind of background context. And then when the and also the other thing I'll say is just general impression that the people who do ultimately make the decisions, and that in an institution like my own, it's the board of trustees is ultimately the body that really makes all those kinds of decisions. Any important decision for the university has to go through the board of trustees, including my own tenure, let's say, or my own promotion.
Right.
And so my increasing sense that the people who sit on that board, and those are the people who hire the president of the university, who then hires all the vice presidents, and all the other runs the administrative operation of the university. Those people really are quite detached from the actual function of the university. We spend our time teaching and doing research, and those are as I see it, those are the main functions of the university: teaching and research. And the people who are the final deciders are people who come from completely different worlds: finance, corporations, from the law, sometimes from government, and they know very little about the university. And it would be one thing if they actually engaged with the people who are doing the actual work of the university, but they seem quite uninterested in the opinions of the people who actually know what happens in a university and what a university is fundamentally about. So there was a kind of I would say that's the underpinning of my experience within the kind of institutional functioning of various of the institutions where I was working, and then when the pandemic hit, this materialized for me in a very concrete way. So the pandemic hit, and all kinds of stuff was happening very quickly. I mean, it was a very chaotic moment, and I don't necessarily blame institutions for responding the way they did. Nobody knew what to do.
Right.
But at my institution, Johns Hopkins, which I get told over and over again is very wealthy. Our president is incredibly successful. He keeps raising more money. We're growing. We're successful. We're wonderful. We're great. And within, I think it was some 4 to 6 weeks after the pandemic hit, the university responded by taking a series of really quite drastic measures, I thought. And some of these, some of them seemed sort of reasonable, like hiring freezes or salary freezes. I mean, that's not crazy. Some of them seemed a little hasty, layoffs and other kinds of things. And some of them seemed downright, they struck me as illegal. I mean, I assume they weren't, but so the one that really hit home was the university decided it was going to freeze our pension contributions. We don't have I don't know if you in the Pennsylvania state system have a real pension. I used to have when I was at the University of Montreal because Canadian, but we have just contributions into our the equivalent of a 401k. It's a 403b, and the university has some required contribution. I thought this was part of my contract, and they announced that they were freezing that, and all that stuff. They said we're looking at deficits of in the hundreds of millions of dollars, coming up, and I thought, wow, this is awfully fast to be making these kinds of decisions. Nobody knows what's going to happen. I can understand being prudent, but this seems as though it's really jumping the gun.
Right.
And so the way that I framed it in my head, the way that I was experiencing that is this was a kind of, shock doctrine, disaster capitalism,
totally.
right?
100%.
This is, these are a bunch of people who sit on our trustees who think, why do we give such generous benefits to our employees? That's crazy. That's a waste of money. We cut that out long ago in places like, in the companies, that we bought in my private equity firm or whatever. And we've looted those pensions ages ago.
Right.
Why are we still doing that here? And so, here an opportunity seemed to come along, and they were obviously ready with the measures to take. And this seemed astonishing to me because these were extreme measures without any input from anybody who was affected by them. There is a sort of faculty advisory budget committee, but no, it's not an elected body. And I've spoken to some of the people who sit on that, and they say that their voices aren't listened to anyway. So they're told again what's going to they're told about decisions that get made sort of before they're announced. That have been made before they're announced. But in no way is that a governance body, right? So anyway. So these decisions got made very quickly, in a very hasty way, in a very non-participative kind of way, and in ways that seemed to move in only one direction. That is to say,
Right.
slashing benefits, slashing labor costs, and so this was, this was a kind of wake up call for me, and even in my very tenured position, sheltered position at a wealthy university. It turns out that an $8 billion endowment. I don't know what the number is. I'm making that up, but something like that. It turns out that being the largest employer in the state of Maryland, it turns out that being that owning half of the city of Baltimore
Right.
is not enough to protect you from quite draconian cuts when the mood hits them, right? Uh, so so it was all that was a sort of so that began my I guess my career, or at least it ratcheted up my career as a troublemaker. Is how I like to think about it. And somebody who writes about and speaks about these issues of university governance and ways in which I mean the broader theme of everything that I have been writing about this, I think, is that our universities are not corporations, and
Right.
they for too long now they have been run as though they are for-profit corporations. They're run by the same kinds of people, people who come out of that world, who know about that world, and don't know much about the world of higher education. And those are the people who are running our system, and they're running it into the ground. That's what I'm worried about.
Yeah, and I think that's there's every reason to be concerned about that for sure. A couple quick anecdotes on this one. One, I think you mentioned about people pre-deciding things after they ask for faculty input. And I always think about, it seems like the data that they're looking for from faculty, they've already made a decision, then they're looking to backfill the data to kind of support what they've already decided to do. And when the data doesn't comport to what they said, they just ignore it. And I remember I used to be the head of our composition program at Kutztown University. And for the longest time, we kept on hearing we need data about like these particular programs. We had an introduction to college composition for first generation college students or students who were struggling with their writing, right? That was a 4-credit class, but it was an elective class. And we had this directed self-placement program, all this stuff. And they said, well, we knew they wanted to get rid of it, but we're like, okay. But it was, well, this shows that this stuff works. And they're like, well, we need data. So we went out, we did the research because we're academics and we do research, and we went out and find best practices. We looked at a variety of programs across the country. We presented them back with data, right? Went to a meeting, and turns out they hadn't read the report that we had given them, right? And then basically said, well, this is nice, but this is not from Kutztown. Like as if Kutztown is somehow its own little micro universe, that it does not obey the laws of physics, that somehow we need only data from Kutztown to determine whether or not it's successful or not. It was like the most absurd thing I've ever heard. But it was like, and we see that as a pattern. And again, it's not, I don't mean to suggest it's just Kutztown. That's just exactly the kind of thing that we see over and over again. Our chancellor just did this with the consolidation of 6 universities into 2. I had all these like workshops and faculty workshops and worker workshops and student workshops, and they just went on and ignored that, to the point where when they gave the presentation about consolidation, instead of actually having student voices represented at the Board of Governors, he made up, right, representative students to tell the stories, right? I mean, it was just insane. But anyways, the irony of your story on Johns Hopkins is exactly when you said this is a shock doctrine policy. I hear this. That's exactly how I heard what you were saying. And not only that, the irony of it is that Johns Hopkins was the go-to place to get COVID data, right? So on the one hand, you had, this is the institution that became central, and you would think there would be enough people that would say, hey, you know what? We don't know what the hell's going on here. We just need to kind of like keep the ship in like going forward in the way that it is. Let's not make any crazy changes. Let's not fire people. Let's make sure that we can deliver what we're doing. But instead, they do something very different. Anyhow. So that's, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, just to bounce back on what you're saying. I mean, I think, I've wondered back and forth whether this is sort of an intentional strategy when you bring faculty in, right? In an ideal world, or at least I don't know. I'm wondering if this is really the ideal world, but in the model that has existed to date, right? Which I take from the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors. University governance is a kind of three-legged stool. It's made up of multiple components that kind of work together, right? So you've got the board of trustees, you've got the university administration, who's the president and everyone else, and you've got the faculty, right? And these all have their main, they've all got their main responsibilities, and they've all got their main functions, but they all work together as a kind of check and balance, right, system. And ideally, they collaborate and so on. But in my mind, that three-legged stool has been kind of kicked apart, in particular, so that the board of trustees and the president, and the board of trustees ultimately oversees the president, and everything the board of trustees knows comes through the president's office, at least in my institution, but I think in many institutions. So meanwhile, the faculty have been more and more pushed aside. And you talk about the experiences that you've had of sitting on committees where decisions are, where the data is irrelevant, right? The decision's just been made. And this is a very disheartening experience for many of us. And I think any academic can tell you a dozen stories like that where they've experienced that kind of thing. And what's the obvious outcome of that, right? Is that, well, the next time I'm asked to serve on a committee, I think, why should I waste my time here? You guys aren't going to take me seriously. This is going to be a huge time commitment for me, and no one's going to listen. So that just demobilizes people to do this. And then, of course, it's a kind of vicious circle at that point, right? Because if the faculty don't give their opinions, then no else's opinion is being solicited. So then the decisions get made even more unilaterally. So whether this is an intentional strategy or just an unhappy outcome is, I guess, a little bit irrelevant. But everything moves in the same direction.
100%. And just so you know, commentary, everybody. So we're having a little issue with your mic. Mike, I don't know if my mic is breaking up for you too as well. We're hearing
a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, we're hearing a
little bit.
Get
off my...
Yeah, maybe try that and see if that makes a difference.
Okay, let me just get on the. Let's see if this helps. Oh, it says while we're recording, I can't change the mic settings.
Okay, hold on. Let me just go ahead. I'm gonna shut that off then. Okay, try that again.
All right, I'm sorry about this.
No, it's fine. It's fine. This is the world of the internet that we're in here. So this is
Yeah. Is this any better?
Yeah, that's much better. Awesome.
Oops. Here, hold on. Let me see. All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. You hearing me okay?
Yep, I am.
Okay, great. Just so you know, if the video, because your video is not going out, but if my video cuts out for you, don't worry about that. I switched it on a low data mode just to make sure that we're maximizing the use of the internet.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Sorry about everybody. But, as everybody knows, right, periodically, the internet does things. Beyond our control, the gremlins take over. Okay. Yeah. So good. So let's talk a little bit about your piece here. Let's get in why Jason Wingard. For all practical purposes, the guy spent less than 2 years at Temple, left after kind of major controversies. And yet you want to kind of dig into his book on higher education and his whole skillification agenda that he brought to Temple and beyond. So can you talk a little about what his agenda is and why you think it's important, why that you thought it was important to pay attention to what he's doing?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing I'll say is I had never heard of Jason Wingard until this Temple hubbub happened. And in retrospect, I think it was probably, from his perspective, a big mistake to have reacted the way he did. What happened for listeners who might not know is that the Temple graduate students who've been unionized for some 2 decades or more, I think 25 years maybe, they had negotiated contracts in the past with university administrations at Temple and never had any major problems, as far as I know, and certainly never had any strikes. This time they were unable to negotiate a new contract with the current administration, and they went on strike. Now, nothing, in that regard, there's nothing particularly unusual about that, because there have been dozens of graduate student either unionization campaigns and strikes. And of course, I'm sure all your listeners know the major strike in California.
Yep.
Tens of thousands, something like 40 or 45,000 or something like that. Graduate students and postdocs in California were on strike last year. So there's a wave of unionization and kind of labor activism washing across higher ed. And that wave smashed into Temple University. And what made Temple unusual, if not unique, is that they reacted in a very aggressive manner. I'm not sure that this had ever happened in the world of higher ed. And what they did, almost as soon as the graduate students went on strike, about a week later, the graduate students, actually without any announcement, they weren't warned about this, they found out that their health insurance had been canceled. And the health insurance was provided by the university, and the university's position was, well, if you're not working, we're not going to provide you health insurance. But what this meant is when students went to pick up their medication at the pharmacy, they suddenly couldn't get it. They said, sorry, your health insurance was canceled. So this can be not just anxiety provoking, but a downright danger to people's health when they're reliant on some kind of medication like that. And I've never heard of this. I mean, this seemed to pull the mask off, right? This is using access to healthcare as a kind of tool of worker discipline, right? Let's get people back to work. And then on top of that, then they sent notices saying, well, since you're not TAing anymore, you owe us tuition, because graduate students get tuition remission for when they do for their teaching. And then so they said instead of paying you now owe us $20,000 or whatever it was. And by the way, late fees will start accruing next month. So this was all very aggressive, amazingly hostile response, and it backfired, I would say, on Wingard and on Temple, because it drew quite a bit of attention, national attention, to a relatively small strike. And that was what got a lot of people interested in Wingard and in what was going on at Temple. And it turned out that the president of the university, Jason Wingard, had published a book last year on the future of higher education. And I confess I hadn't read the book, never heard of the book, never heard of Wingard before this happened. But people began reading it. There was a really fabulous essay in the LA Review of Books that came out about a month before mine, which unpacked his agenda to a certain extent. And then anyway, the Chronicle of Higher Ed got the reviews editor got in touch and said, "Would you like to review his book?" And I said, "Yeah, I would." So I did. And the book was interesting. By the time the essay came out, Wingard had resigned. So I ended up kind of rewriting the book, rewriting the essay, try to decenter Wingard from this. But I really came to think that Wingard's book, it's called The College Devaluation Crisis, Market Disruption, Diminishing ROI, and an Alternative Future of Learning. Now, in the title itself, there's all these kind of academic buzzwords or administrative buzzwords. The book is really poorly written, and it's not very good, but it does really present in a very, I think, in a very stark way, a vision for higher education, for the future of higher education, which is widely shared among the boards of trustees that we've been talking about, among the state legislatures that fund higher education in the country, even in higher, upper echelons of the federal government and in the Department of Education. I think, and I think it's a vision, it's a vision that's shared to some extent across partisan divides. Democratic and Republican administrations have I think bought into this. In certain ways, the Democratic, the Obama administration really bought into this in a very big way. And what it is a vision of higher ed as purely an economic good. Higher education is shorn from any understanding of citizenship, of cultivation of the intellect, of whatever sort of airy-fairy idea one might have about education, and it's narrowed down to a sort of economistic nuts and bolts idea, which is all about providing future workers with skills to enter the labor market of the 21st century. And even within that vision for higher education, for the purpose of higher education, for the purpose of education is what I would say, not just higher education, but for the purpose of education. Even if you accept that premise that is the purpose of education, it still is full of fascinating contradictions and paradoxes. I found. So I began in that essay. I sort of tried to spin out what not just what was at stake for thinking about higher education and the purpose of higher education, but really for a whole vision of society that understands, what I guess I specifically didn't, purposefully didn't use the term neoliberal in the essay, but it is what I think many people would call a neoliberal vision of society, in which everybody is a kind of independent, autonomous entrepreneur, where each of us is our own entrepreneur basically, and we all accumulate a set of skills that we then deploy in the labor market to sell our labor according to skills, and in this vision for society, I mean, power imbalances don't really exist, so I can sell if I'm not able to get a job, it's because I haven't been properly skilled. I haven't skilled myself properly. It's not because there are structural conditions to the world in which poverty is constructed by social policy. It's because I'm not properly skilled, and so it's a very it's a very convenient kind of ideology, I think, for explaining economic inequality, for explaining all kinds of social ills, because you can basically put that at the feet of the individual, rather than trying to look at larger structural explanations for things that might not be working the way we would like in our society.
Right. And you mentioned this too as well. And it's like there's the world as presented, right? The world that through their lens, right? So if you take like something like gig work, right? So from these folks, from this agenda that we see in Wingard, right? Gig work is kind of like, yes, it's an opportunity for individuals to express their creativity and kind of flexibility and show their entrepreneurship freed from the structures of the past, right? It's this heroic kind of like freeing narrative, right? As opposed to gig work as a means for breaking the backs of unions, right? Kind of disrupting the kind of like the working class and driving down wages for you, so you can accumulate more profit through these kind of little Silicon Valley kind of app-based things. I mean, that's the kind of contrast you see between these narratives, right? The story that they're trying to tell, right? Which does seem, as you mentioned at one point in the article, Silicon Valley hucksterism, right? Versus like what a more kind of like direct analysis of the past 30 years of what's been happening both in our economy and in higher education would lead to us in a very different kind of direction, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so it's a very convenient kind of vision. I mean, it helps us understand inequality and poverty and discrimination, and it helps us narrativize that in ways that are less disturbing, right? They can be blamed on individuals. And then there's a kind of ideological work that happens, but then there's also a very kind of material or commercial work that's going on along the side, right? Because
let's talk about the main players that we got going on here.
Yeah, well, so these are all companies. I mean, that I've never heard of, but that are playing an increasing role in higher education.
You call this, right, the alternative educational ecosystem. Right.
That's right. He uses words like landscape and ecosystem a lot, and more or less what I would call this is the privatization of higher education. So it's the kind of outsourcing of a lot of functions of higher education to private companies, for-profit companies, and mostly startups in what Silicon Valley calls ed-tech. And these are companies that have grown very rapidly, with almost all of them funded by venture capital. And that some of them have gone on to IPOs to great effect. Some others have just been bought up by large companies, large multinational corporations. But there are companies like Noodle, which uses learning designers to outsource content creation. So translated, that means we can teach our classes through this platform. These are the there's Practera, which is a fast-growing experiential education technology and programs company that provides customizable platforms to author, launch, and manage experiential learning programs. There's a lot of jargon in this world of ed tech. A lot of it is kind of nonsense, if you ask me. But these are basically taking the functions that have traditionally been done that used to be done by tenure track professors,
100%,
and then were done by adjunct professors, contingent, labor, and I think the next stage of that process is to completely outsource them to these private companies, which can provide what would have been a classroom experience online, and do that in a very standardized way, so that the instructor can expand. I'm sort of limited as a professor, right? If I want to teach a seminar, I probably should limit that to around 30 people if I want it to be effective at all. If I want to teach a lecture class, in a room, perhaps I could teach, in a large lecture hall, maybe I could teach 300, 400 or something like that with a group of TAs. But here with this kind of thing, I can put a course online, or not I, but someone who's paid to create this content can put a course online and teach potentially thousands, hundreds of thousands or more.
And so, what should be said too is that once you do that, right, once you get into kind of like the developers or the creatives to develop this kind of content to put online, you don't even need those people anymore, right? You can just run this as kind of a series of modules that kind of can get graded by, whatever rubric, maybe you need people initially, but eventually you could turn this over to AI to kind of use this rubric to grade all these people to issue them their certificate, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, and a lot of this content isn't so much going to be created. Even if I were to, let's say, record a lecture, it wouldn't be created necessarily by people who are specialists in teach a class in early American history. It wouldn't be taught by necessarily somebody who has a PhD in early American history. It might be taught by a learning design specialist or something like that, right? Who has been trained in perhaps in some kind of pedagogical abilities or not, maybe that was outsourced already. And then maybe I was brought in to consult and make sure that, do a little bit of fact checking to make sure that they're not getting anything fundamentally wrong. And then that would get spun off, right, by a company like this and then reproduced ad infinitum. And then the person who would have served as professor can be turned into a kind of coach, right? That's how they see this. And for these coaches, you don't need a PhD for that. At best, you need maybe a master's degree or maybe not even. And you're there to sort of help the student along through this learning environment or whatever one would call it. So
we probably just need like a certificate in kind of like higher education learning delivery, right?
That's right. Yeah, something like that. Exactly. And I could probably teach a dozen or 24 classes, not teach because, sort of mentor and help students along on this thing. So you can see how, from a certain perspective, this is marvelous, right? Because this allows you to slash costs in a big way. I mean, one of the major costs for universities, of course, in addition to facilities, is labor.
Yep.
As the cost of instructors. So if you can reduce that, you are providing a much cheaper form of education. Whether you're providing a much cheaper form of something, whether you can even call that education at that point is up for grabs. But it is certainly much cheaper to do. And not incidentally, the profits from that don't go into, let's say, the pockets of the people who are doing the work. They go into an awful lot of that gets diverted to the shareholders of these companies that are providing this work.
Right. And let's talk about these companies that are kind of having all this innovation going on in the ed tech world. It'd be one thing if they're kind of making all these pitches and using all this kind of like huckster language and all this stuff. But we're talking about companies. For example, you list in here, you've got companies that are worth like $3.5 billion, $2.7 billion, right? Looking at like, you're talking multi-million or billion-dollar corporations, companies that are seeking to basically skim the profit away, take the basic, what you're doing, right? You're displacing where the money's going. Instead of the money going to faculty and instructors and research, it's going to go to these companies, right? In exchange for, a more controllable workforce, if it will.
Yeah. And from my mind, there's a sad irony because this has already been going on for an awful long time. As I said earlier, this almost feels like the final stage of a process that's been going on for ages. I mean, a couple generations ago in the 1960s, early 70s, 2/3 of instructors in higher ed were tenured or tenure track, and that now we're down to 1/3. Most people who teach in the world of higher education teach in grim conditions. They are underpaid. They don't have any job security. And you have all these stories of people like living out of their cars or, being on public assistance and all kinds of things who are teaching. So we've already gone pretty far down this road of slashing the cost of doing the actual teaching. And so this does feel like one sort of last stage, one more step in a direction that we've already gone pretty far along.
Yeah, 100%. And so maybe the way kind of drilling into this just a bit right here about that direction and that kind of consolidation is at the kind of toward the end of your essay too, is what you're talking about this whole term that Wingard used about skillification. And this is one of these things that brought it down and say, what is all this focus on skills? Because I think like most say faculty members or students for that matter, when we talk about skills, right? Generally, we're thinking about things like, okay, some practically deployable, say, kind of knowledge or practice or kind of ways of doing stuff that allows us to navigate, say, a particular kind of problem, right? Or that kind of stuff. In my university, my university system, they start talking about upskilling, right? So you hear all this kind of like language about skills, but you kind of hone in on this part. We say, well, that's probably not what we might well think that. And, the public at large and politicians and even university presidents for that matter, or university faculty, could be excused for thinking that was what a skill was, because that's probably the way most people think about skills. You say, no, for them, skills is something else. Can you talk us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, this was so. Here's another area where it feels as though we're reaching the stage of parody rather than anything. So we for I teach history. I teach in the humanities, as I think you do too, right?
Yes,
Kevin?
I do. Yep.
And so, for those of us in the kind of beleaguered humanities, we've spent most of our careers hearing about how you don't learn anything practical if you are a student in the humanities, right?
Yep.
And so universities have been shifting, and this has been going on for decades now. They've been shifting into these more applied fields, right? So we all hear about STEM: science, technology, engineering, and math. These are the main things that we need to be teaching our future workers for, because we don't want them learning useless things like how to write a history paper, how to deconstruct a Shakespeare sonnet or something like that, right? That's not gonna give us the jobs of the 21st century. So all this emphasis on applied skills, on kind of applied education, that and then you start to ask, well, what does this mean concretely? Like, what do we want workers to future workers to actually learn? And presumably this is things like coding or whatever, the things that will actually is something that will get you a job right out of graduate school, right out of college. And this is what the employers are always complaining about, right? We have these students coming out of these fancy Bachelor of Art programs, and we have to train them to do the things that we want them to be doing, as though that's a crazy idea that they should train their workers. So we've been pushing people in that direction, and then there are several, I think, fascinating kind of ironies that come out of this. One is that when you actually ask the employers, concretely, like, what is it that you want your students to know? Is it something like coding? I mean, is that what you want them to know, or do you want them to know, like, I don't know, massage therapy or something like that? You're just like, well, actually, you'll ask them, well, what we really want them to know, we want them to be problem solvers, right? The work of coding is always changing, right? You can learn how to code today, but in a year, many of those skills will be outdated. So what you need to learn is how to be a learner. You need to learn skills of critical thinking. We want people who can write well, who can communicate well. And those, over and over are the skill, the sort of skills that employers say they want. And so then, you pause for a second, you say, wait a second, those were the things, I thought that's what I was teaching in my history classes, right? Critical thinking, how to write, how to pose problems, how to ask questions, how to communicate clearly, how to present data, right? These are the things that I thought I was teaching in my class, but I was told, no, history is useless. Go into engineering, learn coding, whatever it might be. So that's irony number one. But irony number two is, by the time I got to the end of this book, this kind of awful but fascinating book, I was puzzled. What exactly are the skills that Wingard is talking about? Because he's not talking about, although the employers tell him from time to time, we want critical thinking. That's not actually what he's talking about. And what emerges by the end of this book is a really amazing, I think, I called it a plot twist in my essay, which is that a skill doesn't really have any content. A skill, as they're described, I say, it's only near the end of the book that you actually learn. It's not an aptitude that you learn in a classroom setting or even in a practical setting. It's actually what someone tells Wingard is the descriptor of work. It's a common vocabulary or an important currency. So we've gone into this sort of, as I see it, a kind of financialized world in which skills have become something that can be read by employers, by HR departments, really. So you provide a kind of fake education, and then provide a fake certification so that the HR department in a company can read that fake certification and place you in exactly the right sort of slot. And so I quote from some of these figures, so there's a company chief learning officer who says that people will eventually begin to think of themselves in terms of skills, and that can turn into projects, roles, opportunities. And laid off workers who lack the startup capital to invest in themselves can contract themselves out to merit-based financing startups. This is something that, by the way, has been out there lately, right? This is seen as a kind of solution to the student debt problem. Instead of taking on debt, why don't you become a
award of the corporation?
Exactly. We'll get capital to invest in you, and then you can pay dividends to your investors as you come to gain income, right? And so this is the ultimate stage in a kind of financialized version of the worker, right? The worker who doesn't actually have a skill, that is to say, I can't sit down and make make copper tubing or something like that, right? I actually am selling off my skills before they've even been acquired, so that someone else can gain the revenue from my future labor. It's a really extraordinary kind of it's an extraordinary kind of vision, I think, and it emerges if you read sort of between the lines of what these people are saying.
Well, 100%, and I think that I think when you've got these kind of, I don't know. I've been saying this for a while. I've told this story before on the show, and I don't want to go too long. I know I'm keeping you longer than I promised you to begin with, but it's like, I remember I read this book by Winners Take All. I know it's Anand Giridharadas, right? And he was writing about this fiction about how philanthropy and these kind of like rich Silicon Valley enlightened billionaires are going to basically save us all through their philanthropic kind of giving, right? And of course, he starts to break down in this book the language of Silicon Valley, of innovation, of everything you basically are talking about in this essay, right? And I was listening to it as an audiobook back and forth. I got about an hour commute. I was listening to an audiobook coming back and forth from work. And I finished it this one day. I was sitting in my parking lot, like at work, for that last like few paragraphs here. And our new Chancellor Dan Greenstein, who came out of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, ran their higher ed division, is all this kind of ed tech kind of guy. He was actually visiting. He just got appointed to be chancellor, and he was at Kutztown University that day to kind of do his welcome talk, his tour of the campuses. And I walked from my car directly to where he was giving his talk. Right, so I get there, I sit down, and I was like, "Holy crap!" Everything I just read about and the critique of all this stuff, the things that you're talking about in this essay, were coming out of this guy's mouth, right? And I mean, it was the kind of thing where I say, well, whatever. And what I started to realize over time, he's saying all these words to all of us as if we, faculty and students and the community at large, that we're the audience, right? But we're not. And what you just said, this stuff about skills, right? This idea is as an exchangeable currency among who? University presidents and businesses and all these people in these ed tech firms. So it's an interchangeable commodity. Whereas the students, the ones that inhabit the skills, right, they're irrelevant here. They're just basically telling employers about how to think about the workforce in such a way that is going to get them more money. That's the way I kind of I walk away from this stuff, because I find this so disgusting, right? That it's a dehumanization of faculty, of students, and frankly, of our kind of like entire kind of social order, if you will. And I don't mean to kind of go too hyperbolic here, but I mean, this kind of language, right? And as you have correctly said, of course, this has been a long march, right? They've been on this train for, since the 1960s and slowly kind of gutting what has happened in kind of higher education. But to see now that people are getting appointed, right, to head positions at place Temple University and elsewhere to carry out this agenda, right? And knowing that the victims of this are not only just going to be us as faculty, but are going to be those students who are then going to be released into this world that is going to expect them to somehow piece together a living, right, by selling themselves to the highest bidder. I mean, it's disgusting to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I think it's a little bit of the stage of capitalism we're in, right? I mean, we've moved, we deindustrialized, and then we turned ourselves into a service economy, and then once you reduce the need for service itself, right, for labor itself, what do you do with the capital? You can invest in. Yep. You can invest in individuals without actually individuals as laborers, right? Individuals as objects of capital, and so there's something extraordinary going on there for sure. There's, I think, the book that you talk about, Winners Take All, I think it's just a really great book, and it's been a little while since I read that book, but one of the things that I take away from that book is that the people who created the world that we live in and who most benefit from the world that we live in aren't going to solve the problems generated by that world, right? And if we think they are, we're fooling ourselves. And it all in a sense comes full circle, right? Because those people, the ones that you're talking about, I mean, these billionaire philanthropists, these are the people who sit on the boards of universities, right? I mean, they are they're the people who are ultimately calling the shots in the institution where I teach and where you teach. And and there's an intimate, I think, relationship between those people and between the kind of foundation world that you're talking about, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but not just that one. I mean, they've been particularly interested in education and kind of changing the way that education is delivered. But I think there's an awful lot of foundations that have been doing this work. And I don't mean by any stretch to sound conspiratorial here, because I think, the way they see it, they're doing good work, doing important work, good work. I mean, this is well-meaning donations, right? I don't think people are understanding this as a kind of insidious plot to transform the nature of higher education. But they come out of a kind of sort of ecosystem, if we can use Wingard's words. They come out of a kind of epistemological context in which it makes sense to transform higher education in this way that will not incidentally also generate profit, right, and cut costs. And so, I had a really interesting exchange. One of the people who reached out to me after the article came out was somebody named Neil Krause, who teaches at Wisconsin, and he's written a book where that will be coming out soon, where he talks about where did this idea of education as skillification, right? Education as generating skills for workers. Where did this really come from? And he traces it back to the early 1980s when there was a kind of move to blame unemployment and other things on the skills gap, right? And he says this was basically invented. I mean, this is an idea I kind of bumped into in my essay, kind of I think a little unwittingly actually, but this was all sort of invented, the skills gap, by these foundations that began to measure what they understood to be skills among the skills that were needed by workers and by the employment economy, and the skills that weren't being provided by the educational system. And this became one of the wedges through which people could begin really critiquing and trying to reform higher education as something that needed to be much more practical, much more focused on something. And as I say, I sort of bumped into this idea in my essay, which is like, what is this alleged skills gap that we have, right? Because Wingard even says at one point, we've got all these workers with skills who aren't getting employed. And then you have these employers saying, we want skills that liberal arts education has been providing. So what is this skills gap that supposedly exists? And according to Neil Krause, it's largely made up. And they rely, he goes back through BLS data, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and he says, if you look at the government data, there is no skills gap, actually. It's kind of an invented concept by people who just have a hunch that this is what explains kind of structural features like unemployment. Right?
Yeah, it's remarkable, and it goes right to, I mean, this is a whole other show to talk about what they did through K through 12 through exactly this logic of this skills gap. And this is like the birth of the kind of the big data solution, the billionaire solution to like problems in education, which their own kind of like findings, like years later, there was, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, of course, had this, this had a huge impact what happened to K through 12. And then you had, they said, okay, we're going to get the Rand Corporation, that libertarian think tank. We're going to get them to study like how successful this has been. And the Rand Corporation came back after all this study and all this, like, yeah, it's kind of negligible. So like, we turned up completely undid the entire way that we did K through 12 education. Now they're trying to do exactly the same thing to higher education, or more correctly, as you've been saying, they have been doing this and kind of leading us to where we are today. So let me ask you this as a way of kind of not leaving us in kind of my preferred space of the dystopian future. but one thing you do mention, like, look, it's kind of like, part kind of warning, part call, part kind of acknowledgement about what it's going to take. You basically say, look, unless there's a much broader coalition that is going to push back against this stuff, this could very well be our future, right? And it's kind of going down, the downward spiral, race to the bottom all over again. So given the fact that, say the birth of looking at this book was at Temple and what was going on in the Temple strike, do you see any kind of signs of that kind of coalition or kind of hopes in a direction that's pushing back against some of this kind of like, Silicon Valley hucksterism that is kind of looking to kind of degrade higher ed?
I think so. I mean, I don't know if I'm being naively optimistic after being so critical and depressing here, but but there are certainly reasons to be hopeful. about the future. One of them has to do with one of them is in the strike itself, right? In the graduate student strike. I mean, look who's out of a job right now. It's Wingard, right? It's not the graduate students. They ultimately won. They got a contract. It didn't get them everything they wanted, and still doesn't give them a living wage, actually. But but it's a big improvement over what they had. They get some parental leave. They get health care for their dependents, and they got a substantial pay raise. So so they won a lot, and Wingard got fired. So even right there, there's some sign for hope. And what is it that led to that? Well, it was labor action, right? It was solidarity. It was labor action by the students, and it was ultimately the solidarity of the faculty that was outraged by the actions of Wingard, not just the faculty, but the students and the broader community, right? The kind of media attention that this brought, which pushed Wingard out and may well push the president of the board of trustees. I haven't been following actually in the last few days, but so that's something. Then there's of course all the broader labor action that I alluded to earlier, right, across higher education. Last year,
the Rutgers strike that's still kind of potentially they might go back on the line if they don't get this thing. I mean, there's a amazing example of solidarity across even divisions.
You're not kidding. I think that one is even more impressive, actually, than perhaps the graduate student strike in California was an impressive run, not just because of its size, which I mean it was huge, right? This was 40-some thousand workers, but also because the postdocs got what they wanted and then stayed on strike to support the graduate students. There's solidarity, right? And then the strike at Rutgers is the most impressive of all of the ones that I've seen. Again, this is not my field. I'm sort of a dilettante in this area. I follow it as an activist, not as a scholar. But I think that's the most impressive that I've seen right now. Because what was that strike fundamentally about? It was fundamentally about the adjunctification of higher education, right? Of teaching. And the people like me, right? The tenured faculty who have secure perks and actually whose perks, and we have to say this, we have to be honest and open and frank about this, are the perks of our, like the benefits that we get as salaried, protected wage employees come at the expense of the people who are exploited, of the adjunct workers who are doing our teaching in part, right? So that rather than pitting the privileged elite faculty against the underprivileged, toiling, masses, if I can put it that way. I don't mean that at all to be to make that sound denigrating. Instead of pitting those two against each other, this strike brought them in alliance, right? So the tenured faculty were in support of better working conditions, better wages, better benefits for adjunct labor, and that, in my mind, is the most hopeful thing that I've seen, and they look like they're on the cusp of winning that, because ultimately, we can't turn higher education around if the labor conditions don't improve, right? If we don't reverse the system by this massive trend by which we have increasingly turned teaching into a precarious employment, into contingent employment, into underpaid labor. So that's an incredibly hopeful thing. And to push back ultimately against, I think the next stage then is to figure out how are we going to govern these institutions in ways that are going to better reflect the values that these institutions are meant to be embodying and meant to be promoting, and the kinds of work they're meant to be doing within society. I don't mean to be utopian here. I don't think universities are going to solve all our social problems, but they do and should stand apart from the kind of for-profit world of much of the economy. And until we have a kind of leadership that recognizes that these are different entities. And that they have different purposes and they do different things and they can't be governed by the same rules that apply to the widget makers. I think we're in big trouble. So this seems to me the first stage, right? A kind of labor action, labor solidarity, and ultimately moving through the kind of political system, both through institutionally within universities and then ultimately in the broader political system. I think that's how change is going to happen. And there are glimmers that this is happening. There really are.
100%. And I can't think of a better place to close this out. And like 100%, this is like what we're seeing over and over again. It's like, do we have like the hope that, the solutions are going to trickle down, right, from these folks, or what we've been saying in this program for years, right? It's organizing and direct action, which are going to get the goods. And the broader that coalition, the broader that we kind of organize both in our communities, around our workplaces, around the more that we have kind of hope for the future, kind of our kind of immediate lives, right, and the future of this country and of democracy itself. So, Francois, I can't tell you how much I appreciate having you on the show today. Thank you so much for your work, and thanks for coming on.
It's been a pleasure. Bring me back sometime.
Oh, you got it. 100%. Now you've caused yourself a problem because I'm going to be like, hey, listen, I saw that article come out here. You want to get back on. I'd love to have you back on in the future. It'd be fantastic.
All right. This has been fun. Really fun.
100%. So everybody want to make sure you check this out. François Furstenburg's article. It's called Higher Ed's Grim, Soulless, Ed-Techified Future. I cannot recommend it enough. If you have any problem getting access to that, you just let me know and I'll make sure you get yourself a copy. How's that? All right. So this is Kevin Mahoney, creator and founder of Raging Chicken. Want to remind you that you can help support the show by heading over to patreon.com/rcpress. We will be back on Friday with our Friday Politics Roundup, and we'll be back on May 8th with that's going to be a great show. I mean, the show on May 8th, I just got to say, you got to come back. Mark Engler will be on the show. We're going to be talking about his article, Can Movements Keep Politicians from Inevitably Selling Out? So stick around. We're going to tell you what's going to be on our May 1st show. I'm looking forward to, all the work ahead. Organize. That's the only solution, everybody. We all know that. Let's get out and do it. All right, have a great weekend, everybody. We'll be back. Or what weekend? What am I talking about? Have a great week, everybody. We'll be back to see you on Friday. I'm out of here. See ya!